So as we move towards talking about the turn of the 20th century, there's really a lot going on in the world. It's almost misleading to say that this week covers one topic when it's really covering a few perspectives on this particular time period. We talked about the advancement of technology and of industrial production a little bit last time in class. Um, it's also worth pointing out that the world, besides the kind of tangible changes, is really going through a whole host of smaller, more subtle changes that are societal. So the roles of women are changing, the roles of machinery are shifting, the roles of government and politics are changing, nationalism is building. And while there's a lot of potential to be excited about what this means for the future, it really also provokes an anxiety and a fear of what these changes are going to bring and how they're going to impact daily life. So we see an embracing of technology on the one hand, but also a reaction against technology in other sectors of kind of stylistic movements at this time. So one place that we can start is back in Chicago. So last class we were looking at the World's Fair, or the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. And in this place, remember, we have this gleaming white Beaux-Arts style city that's master planned by Richard Morris Hunt. And it highlights the future. It highlights the future of globalization and styles and technology. But it's also highlighting the architects of the local emerging movement in Chicago, which is going to be known as the Chicago School. And the Chicago School is really the first uniquely American contribution or style in the field of architecture with a capital A. And the Chicago School is roughly the last 20 years of the 1800s till about 1910, 1920, maybe at the very end. So for a good 30 years in there, we see this strong style emerge out of Chicago that will then be mimicked really all over the U.S. and even all over the world. It's based on technology, and this is one of the things we see here in this building by William LeBaron Jenney, which is on the screen and has a nice red dot, if you'll notice. So the Chicago Home Insurance Building here radically changes what is possible in architecture. And LeBaron Jenney creates the first fully metal frame building in this project. So the internal frame of this building incorporates steel. Remember, steel is kind of newly introduced as a possible building material. It's stronger, it's more lightweight, and it's more fireproof than working with iron or masonry. So it becomes remarkable and pretty famous pretty quickly, known for its height. The building, when originally built, is 138 feet tall and 10 stories tall. And in 1890, there's an addition to it that makes it 180 feet tall, and we get 12 stories then. So this building is known as the first skyscraper because of its height and because of what this steel frame is able to allow the building to achieve. And this is really the beginning of the future of tall buildings that are all going to have internal steel structural skeletons. And this allows for the idea of a curtain wall. So the curtain wall is a term that really means that the walls on these tall buildings don't have to bear any weight. They're free to be glass, and they don't have to have any more heavy stone or brick or masonry to support the structure. So William LeBaron Jenney, with this project, kind of radically changes what is possible in architecture, and particularly in urban architecture. We see the skyscraper as a landmark, a hallmark of downtowns. So one of the next buildings that's trying to achieve this Chicago style, and really does, is Daniel Burnham and Root's Monadnock building. So the Monadnock building is just 6 years after the Chicago Home Insurance Building, but we see a really different aesthetic to this project. It's taller. It's 16 stories now, not the 12 that this other building was in 1890. These 16 stories are fully supported with both iron, concrete, and masonry. So it's somewhat of a hybrid of all these different structural possibilities. And even though there is iron and concrete inside this building, it's really heavily relying on its masonry. And this is part of why we see such a thick brick exterior facade here. You almost can't tell it's brick, but it is. So let's see, if we go to the next slide here, the brick, now you can see the brick. It's smooth, it's emphasizing, or I suppose de-emphasizing the individual pieces of brick and emphasizing a smoothness and a oneness of this particular facade. So the brick is almost wanting to function like concrete. There's an emphasis towards a lack of ornamentation, which is very different than what we're seeing here in the Chicago Home Insurance Building. This building is still relying on a somewhat neoclassical facade. So at the Chicago Home Insurance Building, we see a true lack of ornamentation. And the one thing that they really do painstakingly ornament is this font. So they make sure that the name of the building, there's no sign hanging off of the side of the building, which would be further ornamentation, but they make sure that the name of the building is inside this facade. And the name itself is in the sans serif bold contemporary font that's akin to some sort of Arial or Helvetica, the way we would think of it now. So the aesthetic really declares itself modern, even if the materials here yet aren't fully embracing the modern possibilities of steel. And then the next master of the Chicago School really is Louis Sullivan. And Louis Sullivan is someone you will focus a lot on this week. Sullivan was partners with Adler, so Dankmar Adler and Louis Sullivan had a firm together, and that's what the subject of your next video is going to be about. It's their auditorium building in Chicago. But Louis Sullivan kind of goes off on his own and does architecture by himself. He also writes, he's a phenomenal theorist, and really he shapes the whole modernist discussion. So when we think about form versus function, this is a contribution. This goes back to an essay that Louis Sullivan wrote in 1892 that starts to question and wrestle with what is the right way to build, what is the right style for architecture, and what we see through his architecture, not only with Adler but also by himself, is an incredible propensity for both. He includes a very kind of strong form with this building. So we see this strong rectangular shape that's very clear, sharp edges. There's ornamentation kind of inside this, but not at these edges to prove or to highlight the strength of this form. But when we look at the details within the ornamentation are incredibly dense and expressive and repetitive. So it's almost at once less ornamented overall, but in the places that do contain ornament, the concentration of the ornament is nearly unfathomable. He's a master of his craft here. So the Wainwright building is 10 stories tall, but it really emphasizes its height through the use of some neoclassical tropes where he's taking these vertical elements and having the horizontal pieces interrupt and the vertical elements run smoothly throughout the facade. So you focus on those vertical elements, and then he kind of caps them with stuff akin to the capital of a column or the base of a column. So he's referencing neoclassical architecture, but really going off in his own direction as well. He's embracing certain naturalistic patterns and imagery within some of his ornament, which is inspired a little bit by a few movements, Art Nouveau movement happening in Europe, which again we'll get to. So he's really a master of merging all these different things, and through his writing, which you'll also read this week, you will see it's not an accident. It's a very purposeful attempt to really understand and piece together what's next. Now that we can do all this stuff, what should we be doing and what's right? And one of my favorite Sullivan buildings here is actually a very small mausoleum, or it's sometimes known as the Wainwright Tomb. So Wainwright was the benefactor who funded these buildings, and then his wife dies, and he makes her this tomb in 1892. And the tomb itself from the exterior, I think, looks like it has pure geometries. The circle and the square really emerge as the two geometric motivations here, but you can see just even in the detail of how he's framing or highlighting the geometry, an immense set of ornamentation. And once we enter this thing, this is my favorite part about this, the interior of this mausoleum is so exquisitely detailed. The mosaic tile, the patterning, the color, the texture, the detail. Sullivan is a master at merging this almost refined level of pure geometry with a very detailed ornamentation. And the drawings here, so this is a section drawing of this project, which gives us a little bit of relationship of scale. Here are the stairs, the burial underground, and some of the space that would exist here, and then the overall dome that exists. The drawing, the architecture drawing, does not begin to communicate anything about the interior ornamentation. This drawing communicates form, while when we really look at the way he treats the surfaces, a whole new world opens up. So Sullivan is in and of himself, a huge contradiction in architecture and in interior architecture particularly. So the form isn't what's expressive within a Sullivan project. It's the surface treatment of the form and the detail of the form. And just to kind of prove this, looking at the exterior elements within this, you see something that looks like it's inspired by nature, maybe by sea creatures or fossils or plant life, but oh my goodness, the level of detail and ornamentation here. It also speaks to an almost Gothic elongation. If we start to look at the actual kind of attenuated forms here, the geometry of this stuff is actually now really coming back into fashion, and a lot of architecture schools are kind of basing classes on studying Sullivan's geometries, because now that we have the computer, we can almost mimic or learn from these in a whole new way that we couldn't without the computer. So studying and understanding all of the pattern making that is embedded in these Sullivan projects, which from far away look pretty simple, and then the closer you get and the more detail you zoom into, the more you realize what an incredible master of geometry and of architecture and of design that this person is. So today you will be watching a video that details the auditorium, which is a great interior perspective of how the architecture, the furniture, the lighting, the staircases, the whole interior comes together through the eyes of these two masters. And then the reading portion will look at Louis Sullivan grappling with how do we design, what's the best way to design, and how should ornament factor into this new modern world that you're entering. Okay, keep going.